welcome back to Special Session. I'm Bryan Schott with Utah Political Watch. Today's guest is Dr. Jacob Rugh, a professor of sociology at Brigham Young University. He's been tracking something pretty remarkable. He says Utah has swung more Democratic since 2004 than almost any other state in the country, more than Colorado, more than Virginia, more than Maryland. We get into why he thinks that's happening, whether it's really about Donald Trump or something deeper going on with Utah Republicans and MAGA, what it means for the fight over redistricting and Proposition 4, and why Stuart Adams and Phil Lyman both lost their primaries this year. Now, before we get to that interview, two quick things. First, if you're enjoying this show, if you get some value out of it, hit subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you've got a few seconds, leave a rating and review. That helps other people find the show. Second, I do this reporting independently. There's no corporate support or billionaires behind Utah Political Watch. It's just me, and it's supported directly by readers and listeners like you. If you value independent coverage of Utah politics, please consider becoming a supporter at utahpolitics.news. That's what keeps this going. All right, here's my conversation with Dr. Jacob Rugh. Professor Rugh, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I want to talk about some of the things you've been posting online that, some people could say that they are nothing more than hope core for Democrats. You talk about how Utah seems to be swinging blue. Me, as an eternal skeptic, I always have to say I'll believe it when I see it. But let's talk about some of the things you've been posting online. One of the things you posted is that you point out that Utah swung blue more than any state in the union since 2004 or 2012. It's a D plus 24 swing. Can you explain what you're seeing in that swing? And then I've got a follow-up question for you on that.
Sure. Yeah, what I'm seeing is the peak for Republicans at the presidential level in Utah was with George W. Bush and Mitt Romney in 2004, 2012. And it was a pretty high peak, right? Utah was very red, one of the reddest states in the country. And so it didn't have really anywhere to go except down. And what's remarkable is that it swung blue even more than states like Colorado, Maryland, Virginia. There's a lot of other states that have voters that have some similarities we can talk about later that are pretty well known. Colorado going from a red state to a purple state to a solid blue state. But in fact, over this 20-year period, Utah swung left. Even more. And what's important is using that 2004 data point so that people don't think this is just about Mitt Romney doing well among Utah voters. It really was W. Bush, compassionate conservatism. That was one of the peaks, 2004.
Okay, but when you look at what happened after 2012, it's Donald Trump. And Utah is probably the least MAGA of the red states. I mean, he did not win a majority here in 2016.
That's right. He got 45%.
In 2020, underperformed in 2024. So how much of that swing do you think is attributed to the fact that, for the most part, Utah Republicans are not like MAGA Republicans you see in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I mean, that gets right to the chase here. MAGA overtaking the Republican Party, it has not been complete in Utah. It did overtake the rest of the Republican Party, I believe, the day that Spencer Cox endorsed Donald Trump in 2024. That was 8 years after 2016. So as you rightly point out, both institutionally in terms of the elites and the regular Republican voters that you and I know well in this state, it is still a fight 10 years later for the Republican Party. That's notable. Utah does stand out, and that's pretty well known among people who talk about LDS voters, just as Mormon voters, that it has been different. It's known for being more welcoming to immigrants, just to give one example. So it's taken a long time. And again, Trump, according to the best data, didn't do any better with LDS voters in 2024 than 2020, even though he swung 6 points right among people who are not LDS. Utah barely budged a point, and Harris would do better than Biden, which didn't happen in other states. So clearly, 3 times in a row, people have been able to weigh in on Trump, and he has underperformed massively with Republicans. So as you point out, most of that change, 2016 onward, is Republicans changing their minds and not voting for Republicans. Now, we can talk about the background changes happening slowly in Utah later, but that is mostly an anti-MAGA thing. And I do believe and have found that there are data supporting, such as 2022 re-election run of Mike Lee, Burgess Owens, his congressional race. There are other data points when MAGA candidates run who support overturning the election, like January 6th. They also underperform. Not as much as Trump, but they do underperform. So this is mostly Trump, but also part MAGA. And that's probably an interesting conversation. What happens when the voters start to see this happen at in the state legislature? Do they start to connect the dots, as we've seen in the primary, and rebel against the more established MAGA Republicans?
We can get into that in a second, but people, when they look at this shift in Utah and say, "Oh, that's just the Trump effect," but part of the problem is the Republican Party has become the MAGA Party. They have become a populist movement that basically has Trump at the center. It's almost like a cult of personality. And so, talk about what sort of effects you might see going forward here in the state on the ballot when you've got the Republican base, choosing MAGA type candidates simply because that's who the Republican Party is now.
Yeah, that is. The takeover is complete. We know that's true nationally. It's almost complete at the state level. We are going to see this come to a head even more. In particular, if our lieutenant governor, who defends mail-in voting, Deidre Henderson, if she runs for governor, that is going to be a major point of division within the Republican Party. I'm not a registered Republican. I have been a temporary Republican to help some people I know, some great Republicans. That won't ever happen again. But that is going to be a major point. That is a great example. This is going to happen in many districts, and it relates to gerrymandering, right? There's a correspondence here. If they draw safe districts, they're going to be more likely to have extreme candidates at the convention and the primary level. The more competitive districts and some of the ones that are changing, like in Davis County that we've seen recently, swinging left more in the presidential elections, those will be sites where we see people reject this more. And of course, there are issues that come and go. Fair maps and the data centers are two of the most prominent ones. And of course, misconduct by ICE and ICE warehouses that have been purchased at inflated values. Those are three issues in particular that obviously will animate voters from multiple political parties, the independents. What I've seen here in Utah is a tremendous organization among moderate Republicans, women voters, to participate in the presidential caucus, where Nikki Haley did so well against Trump, winning Davis County, Salt Lake County, winning Provo, winning Mike Lee's precinct in Provo. They are still committed to saying, we want to have an influence on who's elected. So we're going to participate in the primary process. I could see the day in the future when Utah becomes more of a light pink state, like say Arizona was, 10 years ago, those people voting more as independents in the general elections, swing general elections. But we're still at the point right now where most people say, I've got to vote for the moderate, because if I don't, it'll be just what you just talked about, right? It'll be the MAGA extremist. And we've seen both outcomes in Utah. And I think we're all a little bit surprised that Lyman did so poorly against Celeste Malloy, for example. But I think that just reflects the midterm electorate and the current year and the current environment.
Yeah, I was, I thought that Celeste Malloy might have some trouble when she was put into this new district where 2/3 of the voters there had never seen her name on a ballot, but she absolutely stomped Phil Lyman. But if you look, but at the end of the day, Phil Lyman's campaign didn't do the things that a campaign is supposed to do. They didn't run like a campaign who wanted to win. They were spending a lot of their time on social media and really catering to the more conspiratorial base of the Republican Party. And also, I get the feeling, and I was speaking to a lot of people at the state convention, that Republicans are just started getting tired of his antics, and they're just tired of Phil Lyman. And so I'm wondering if those are two of the factors that we saw.
I've heard the same thing. Speaking to people that are members of the legislature, people who lobby the legislature, activists, nonprofits, people from both parties, just saying that this was kind of the third year that lots of very punitive and extreme, I would call it copycat legislation that's copy and paste from national, right-wing organizations. I think it's the third year is proposed at the same rate, but it did not pass at the same rate as the previous 2 years. And we can talk about some of the anti-immigrant things from Trevor Lee and others, but those things really flopped because moderates and people in the middle just said, either we're tired of this doesn't represent Utah, it doesn't address our concerns about data centers, ICE, and the Great Salt Lake, traffic, the Olympics coming. I mean, there's a million other things to prioritize. And it just kind of lost steam. And we are in a moment now of another blue wave like we saw in 2006 against George W. Bush. There's so many similarities with this 2004 reelection when Democrats thought they were in the wilderness. They'd never come back. And it's just so similar to 2006. There are things, of course, that are different. But, of course, the war in Iran, so many forced errors, as you might say in tennis, by the Trump administration. You think about why Biden lost, right? Because of a once in a 100-year pandemic that he cleaned up the mess. And every time I talk to a Trump voter, I say, the best thing Trump did was Operation Warp Speed and the vaccine that he took and everything. That was great. And then we wrapped up and had those waves of the coronavirus. That was extremely disruptive, right? This is like this, Spanish flu, the pandemics in the 19 teens. And then, of course, we had the war in Ukraine, which was started by Russia, right? Who Trump supports Putin. And that, of course, influenced the supply chains, price of grain, other things. So you had these two external things that, Biden was not responsible for, right? But then he gets punished for. And I completely am sympathetic if the prices are high. And so it is poetic justice that Trump made prices even higher due to decisions by his own administration, right? The tariffs and the war in Iran. So it's very poetic karma, right? Coming back to them. And they're going to pay a huge price at the ballot box. And I mean, I don't know. You can think of a million places, the Mar-a-Lago district in Florida, Tarrant County, Texas, where Fort Worth is a very red place like Utah County. All over this nation, right? The blue wave is flipping people out of office.
Well, since you've gone there, let's talk about that. And there's some other things that I want to get to a little bit later in this interview, but you are talking about the blue wave. And, I'm thinking back to 2018 when a big Democratic wave was able to help Ben McAdams win his 4th congressional district race against Mia Love. That was an R+13, according to the Cook Political Report. And the wave was just big enough to push him over the finish line, because you remember he won by less than 1,000 votes in that. As you've pointed out, we're seeing the generic ballot showing Democrats at +11 nationally, which is not a good place for the Republicans to be. How much of that do you think that this national environment is transferable to a state like Utah? And what sort of effects do you think we might see if we do get a D+11 blue wave in November?
Yeah, I think two of the things that I think of are the legislative supermajority that the Republicans hold in Utah will not be broken in one cycle, but I do think Democrats will chip away at it. I think at a minimum 2 to 3, and if we really stretch, maybe 6 or 7, right? That's a stretch. But, that's within the range of, potential outcomes. But at a minimum, 2 or 3 seats will flip blue in the legislature, I think. And that will begin to chip away, and it will begin to change their calculus and I think encourage more of that compromise in the moderates to feel like they have more power. And of course, a future governor is really important that we don't have a supermajority, because we had a previous governor, Herbert, who exercised a lot more leadership and power over the legislature. And that was the big divide in Utah between Herbert and the legislature. But he actually, used his power. Now, Cox, when he doesn't have that, he's just been reduced to occasional vetoes, right? And just giving in on so many other things and becoming partisan.
But didn't Herbert also have to deal with a super majority?
I don't think it was the same degree.
It wasn't as large as it was. So towards the end, it might have been, but
Yeah.
the Republicans were still over 50 in the House.
They were, and
Yeah,
so probably the difference. I'm glad you interjected. Is probably just the MAGA contingent, right, being so big and the copycat legislation.
Well, and it also comes down to whether or not you decide to show some spine.
Exactly, which Herbert did.
Right,
and he of course is more experienced and more seasoned than Cox. The other thing would come down, your question was about the blue wave manifesting in Utah, would also come down to if this, how we want to put it, the fair maps is back on the ballot in terms of an amendment, which will be deceptively worded, but not so deceptively worded that it's struck down. An amendment, I don't know if they're going to have a special session, you know better than I do, later this summer, but I know some people are expecting that. That is something where if you had a big blue wave and the composition of who's voting is like when we got medical marijuana and the Redistricting Commission 2018, that would be again, right, like the worst time for them to try that kind of deceptive amendment this year. I think it will do poorly because the composition of the electorate will be more college-educated voters, more reliable blue voters, and more anti-MAGA voters, right? Whether they're Democrats or not. And that's really, really important to defeating something like that.
I think from a purely political standpoint, the legislature, the Republican supermajority might look at what happened to Stuart Adams, might look at what happened at the effort to put Prop 4 back on the ballot and the signature rescission. And I know you've talked about numbers of that. They don't have to do it this year. And so I wonder if they might hold off and try next year or even in 2030, because they will have time to do all of that. Before it's scheduled to go into effect in 2031, and if you look at the if you look at the push and pull, or weighing the pros and cons, I'm guessing that they don't want to give pissed off voters another reason to show up at the polls this year, especially after what they saw with Stuart Adams.
Yeah, I have no crystal ball, but those are all really good rational reasons to not do it this year. But maybe they still will, maybe they won't, but they will again eventually. We will have a 5th congressional seat added in Utah in 2032. That is for sure, given our explosive population growth. So there'll be 5 seats. There could be, they could make 4 really red ones and just have a vote sink when they crack and pack all the voters into one seat. I could totally see them doing that.
Yeah, it's going to be really hard to gerrymander the congressional seats when we have 5 seats. But I've long argued that this fight over Prop 4 is not over the congressional maps; it's over the legislative maps. Because if the legislative maps are drawn in a fair manner, without partisan data, without considering where incumbents live, and the legislators don't get to pick their voters, that's more of an existential threat to the Republican supermajority up on the Hill than any sort of other political consideration. And that's why they were fighting so hard over these congressional maps, because they're trying to preserve the maps for the House and the Senate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's kind of ironic in the sense that if you had fair maps in Utah, it would still be majority Republican legislature. There's no question about it. They just wouldn't have such a towering supermajority, and they might even be able to get a supermajority if they had great candidates who ran on issues we cared about. So in a way, it's only a handful of seats, right, that are at stake, but it's very existential for them, and it's very much a threat. Where, like I said in a presentation, they sometimes act like a cornered animal. And that's why there's so much ferocious opposition, because it's really about them keeping their seats. And again, it's only a few of them, right? I think most of them are still going to be fine.
And it would also require in those competitive seats, Republicans to actually compete for votes. And this year, Stuart Adams was forced to compete for votes for the first time in his entire career. And he ended up getting beat. He'd never had a primary before. He'd always won the nomination either at convention, and both times he got into the legislature was through a special election where the vote was only among delegates. And so when they opened it up to a wider range of voters, a wider universe of Republican voters, he ended up, the not Stuart Adams vote, even though it was a 3-way primary, the not Stuart Adams vote was almost 2 to 1.
Which says a lot.
You've had a number that really caught my attention. You said that Utah Republican registration is down nearly 4,700 year to date. Democratic registration is up almost 9,700 here in the state of Utah. What do you think is going on there? Do you think it's dissatisfaction with Republicans? Because I think I could make a pretty compelling argument that it's not that the Democratic Party is becoming more attractive to Utahns, because they're still not buying what the Democrats are selling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So 10,000, right, in however many, almost 2 million voters isn't a lot, right? But 10,000 compared to negative 5,000, right? They're going in the complete opposite directions. And generally in an election year, in the beginning, right, before primaries, you see the two parties go up, right, and independent not go up because people are affiliating with a party. But this is the first year that I've seen all the spreadsheets that the lieutenant governor provides, all the Excel spreadsheets, that the Democrats go up and the Republicans go down. So I think there's two things going on. I think it kind of partly agrees with you, partly disagrees. The part that disagrees with you is it's very obvious in the line graphs that I've made that it spikes at the local caucuses and the county conventions. So clearly people attended, registered, became a new voter, or switched their registration. That's very obvious in the data. So Democrats did really well down here in Utah County. We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds at our local and county, and we'd never had that, right? So the Davis County, same story, right? So clearly there's something's going on in the suburbs, and that aligns with all the presidential stuff we've seen in the previous years. And then also something's going on with Republicans, where, they get, the children of Republicans, registered Republicans. That happens a lot with young voters. But clearly, demographically, as a sociologist and a demographer, there must be something happening where Utah is getting older. I know it's the youngest state, but it's getting older rapidly. And it's probably just a natural passive process of 80% of those passing away when I've matched obituaries are Republican. So it's not some exodus of people that are living. I think it's disproportionately older people where Republican is part of it. But there is, parts of the year where Republicans go down when Democrats go up. So, we all know people who are Republican who switch to Democrat. I know a few. It's not that many, but it is meaningful just because it's unprecedented. It hasn't really happened. When you think about states like Alaska and Kansas, there are some precedents for places that are pretty Republican and pretty different, Kansas and Alaska being kind of off the beaten road, where Democrats are able to kind of forge a coalition government like a Montana. So it does happen. It can happen, and it's happening more, where we expect it, right? In Salt Lake County and outside of it. And it is little by little. But if you have another year like this next year and another year like this in 2028, right? Put that together, now you're getting into the tens of thousands.
I want to backtrack for just a second, back to Prop 4 for half a minute. Yes, sir. You have cited numbers that say there's 64% statewide support for Prop 4, 55% among Republicans. Carrie Ann Lisenby tried to make that a big issue in her primary race against Blake Moore, and it didn't move the needle much, if at all. Do you think that that is, because I was watching that race and I was saying this is going to be a test of that message about, Prop 4, the argument that legislative Republicans were making that an unelected judge drew these maps and so on and so forth, and took a power away from the legislature, and it just seems like that argument didn't even land at all. Yeah. Do you think that that's a correct assessment, and do you think that that the Republicans are going to look at that and say maybe we want to hold off a little bit because voters we need more time to try to educate voters on this issue if we're going to make it a big deal?
I think that sounds right. I haven't looked at that carefully in terms of her race, but that's consistent with our conversation and the idea that Republicans might say, you know what, we might just want to try to do this more next decade or in a few years, and they might try something different. Senator Brady Brammer tried something the last minute. They always have something up their sleeve, so they might try something different. But I think they're going to hold off in terms of the timing based on what we're talking about. But that's really interesting because, with Blake Moore, I think he's perceived as more moderate. And again, this was a year where I think the composition of the primary electorate was more moderate. Not being a presidential year, we see this. Let me just say this for the recording. Every time a MAGA copycat runs, they always do worse than Trump. I mean, that is an iron law, right? And we have lots of data points for that, from Blake Masters in Arizona to coast, right? To Mike Lee. And so when Trump isn't on the ballot, right, especially in those cycles, they always underperform, right? They always underperform because there's something about those decades of propaganda that Trump has built up with The Apprentice and people thinking he's a good businessman, even though he's highly unethical. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And so it didn't motivate people, I don't think, against, right? The people that were already motivated by that, no, it didn't change anybody's mind, right? It didn't add any new people. They were already there. The people that leave their Lyman signs up all year, and all the time, they didn't add new people to the coalition. And that's going to be a challenge, right? Because they are older, whiter, and not representing the future of Utah. So that's a long-term thing. And again, like Arizona and Georgia, even Colorado, these things take a while. I mean, if you can believe it, I lived in Minnesota in the 90s, and their legislature had a far-right supermajority, right? And they proposed a lot of kooky bills that were not in line even with mainstream Republicans. And you look today, a generation later, and Minnesota is a beacon of progressive legislation and policy that actually improves lives and has a very high quality of life in a state like Minnesota. So,
two things I want to go over before we finish up here, and I really appreciate your time. Let's talk about the issue of data centers. You have data showing that these are wildly unpopular with voters. And you argue it's because they're a tangible thing. People can see them. They know how much noise they make, how much pollution they put out. I would argue, and I think that you might agree with me, that this was probably the deciding factor in Stuart Adams' loss in the primary, because I've said that if this issue hadn't blown up in his face, he probably would have maybe gotten enough support to squeak through. But voters were really mad about this. And so I'm curious if this is the kind of thing that you think might carry over into November in some of these legislative races. And it might be an issue that Democrats can, if they're savvy, can push their Republican opponents into a corner on.
Yeah. Won't that be so interesting to analyze from a perspective of having more data after the election, seeing which Democratic candidates played on this more, what they did differently, because there's going to be variation across the races. But this was something that was just so high profile that broke through this story, right? Because most of us are kind of segmented in what we consume and see. But a lot like the ICE thing nationally, this Stratos data center became a national story. And Jackie and Gabby and all the work at Elevate Utah to break open these stories, look up on all the records, the stuff you did. So much independent journalism, how important that was. Investigative reporting, right, was vital. And it's incredible that Box Elder County, the two commissioners, were also unseated. I mean, that's even more incredible to me because I already know about Davis County having so many educated voters who are swinging against MAGA. It's truly incredible. I think that was the thing that did Adams in. Without that, he might have made it by in a three-way race. But I think the guy to his right was kind of against data centers, and then Hollis in the middle was, of course, the moderate, and he got vice gripped on both sides, and just that was the end. And we already know about all the corruption and the other things that predated that, but just the process itself, and that's what's so important and kind of connects all our conversations, right? That's why it's so dangerous to sow so much fear and distrust in elections that Trump and his MAGA allies like Mike Lee do, because then if you don't trust the elections, right, we don't have a peaceful transfer of power like January 6th. We don't have the foundation that George Washington set for our democracy. So that's why the process being so corrupt, people said, is actually really not about the size of the data center. It's really about the process, that it was not done correctly. It was done unethically, unlawfully. I mean, so many things that are wrong. And those of us who know the history of the West, right, with the railroads and then the gas stations and the highways, right, there are a lot of people who benefited from getting land, right? There's a reason why Denver's bigger than Cheyenne, all of this chicanery. So people really revolted against that. And it's incredible how it broke through. I mean, it's a great testament and faith to people can unite around something. We still have something we can unite around.
Vice script is a great term, and I'm going to be stealing that. So just be prepared for that, because that's a great term for what happened there.
You bet.
Last thing I want to talk about is your numbers about members of the LDS Church and their self-identification, because I found that really fascinating. You have numbers showing that the self-identification among members of the LDS Church is dropping nationally. Utah's LDS share has fallen from about 67% to 50% since 2000. How much of the blue swing that you're seeing is really a religious realignment rather a demographic shift?
Yeah, I think, some friends of mine in other positions in the Democratic Party have made the same argument that if you just line up the numbers, most of the shift in Utah is due to the LDS voters, right? The anti-MAGA, what I would call them, Harris Republicans, right? Just like the Reagan Democrats who kept saying, we're Democrats, but they kept voting for Reagan over and over and over. These are Republicans who now, 4 elections, right? Romney, McMullen, Biden, Harris, right? I mean, this is 4 times in a row. They're not voting MAGA Republican. They're not reliable MAGA Republicans. They're not going to be. It's not going to change. They're not going to snap back. And just like we said at the beginning, the Republican Party is not going to suddenly go back in time to George W. Bush the day after Trump passes away from natural causes, right? It's not going to happen. It's been completely overtaken by this MAGA extremist movement. And again, when we say completely, that's national, not completely in Utah, right? We've got some people like the governor's wife and the lieutenant governor who continue to fight against it. But this is going to be, it's remarkable. So I'm less interested, just to summarize, in identification rather than vote choice, right? So I'm saying with the Harris Republicans, I really don't care how people register or identify, but if they're voting against MAGA extremism, right? That gives me faith in Utah voters.
I think you're right, because once people start voting a certain way, it's really hard to get them to break out of that and cross over. And I think that that's where we see a lot of the Republican domination in the state come from, because it used to be that this was, almost a blue state. There were a lot of Democrats who were in the leadership of the LDS Church. Professor Rugh, this has been fascinating. I'm going to have you on again. We're going to fight about the Mike Lee, Evan McMullen, and some of your stuff, because I think that some of your conclusions are right, but I don't think that a Democrat could have pulled off what Evan McMullen did, and we'll fight about that in the future. But I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Where can people follow you online to get your data? Because you're really posting some interesting stuff.
Yeah, they can follow me on Bluesky at Jake Rugh, JakeRugh. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much for your time.